The Hargrove County Courthouse had stood on the corner of Aldridge Street and 9th Avenue for 81 years, through 11 elected judges and 4 complete renovations, and it remained what it had always been. The kind of building that requires you to acknowledge it when you walk past. Not because it is beautiful, which it is in the specific understated way of civic architecture from the mid-century, but because it has the specific gravity of a place where people go when things are serious, where the weight of what happens inside is visible in the weight of the building itself, in the limestone facade and the wide steps and the bronze doors that were original and had been polished through 8 decades of hands, to the specific warm shine of things that have been used correctly for a long time. Dorothy May Holloway had been coming to the Hargrove County Courthouse for 41 years. She had come the first time with her husband James at the age of 34 to observe the proceedings in a tenant rights case brought by a neighbor in her block, because James had said you should see how it works, so, you know. And Dorothy had understood what he meant by, so you know, which was so that if you ever need it you are not afraid of it, which was the specific civic education he had given their children and which he extended in his quiet way to the people around him. James Holloway had been a high school history teacher for 32 years at the same school where 3 of his former students had gone on to become attorneys, and 1 had become a city council member. And he had taught history the way some people teach it, not as events that happened to other people in other times, but as the accumulated decisions of ordinary people in specific situations. Decisions that had shaped the world his students were going to inherit, and that would be shaped in turn by the decisions they made. He had said history is not what happened. It is what people chose to do and what they chose not to do and what the gap between those 2 things produced. His students had heard this sentence so many times that some of them, decades later, could still recite it. Dorothy had heard it for 40 years, and it was still true. The courthouse was one of the places where the choosing happened, which was why James had said, "Go see how it works." The choosing happened in rooms with terrazzo floors and limestone and bronze doors, and the rooms were for the public, and the public included Dorothy Holloway. She had come regularly after that for small claims cases when she was building the alterations business in the 80s for the custody hearing of her nephew Darnell in 1997, for the probate of James's estate in 2009 after he died, and for a dozen other moments in 41 years when the courthouse on Aldridge Street had been the place where the serious thing happened. She was 75. She had been a seamstress for 42 years, then the owner of a small alterations and tailoring shop on Vine Street for 19 of those years, and she had retired 3 years before at the age of 72, because her hands were fine but her back was not. And she had decided that the back was not a negotiating partner she intended to argue with indefinitely. She was not large. She was 5'3" with the specific upright carriage of someone who has spent decades working at a machine that requires posture, and with silver hair cut close, and a face that had the specific quality of someone who has been beautiful for a long time and has not spent energy thinking about it, so that the beauty has settled into something simpler and more durable. She dressed carefully. She had dressed carefully her entire adult life, because she was a person who made clothes and who understood that how you presented yourself in the world communicated something specific about how you regarded yourself and the world, which was not vanity, but was what she called consideration. She wore on the Thursday morning in February when she came to the courthouse a dark green wool coat that she had made herself 15 years ago, and that remained because she had made it well as good as it had been the day she finished it, and a gray dress and her good shoes, and she carried a leather portfolio that James had given her for their 40th anniversary, and that she used when she needed to carry papers. James had died 16 years ago at the age of 68 of a heart event that had been so swift and so complete that Dorothy had not had time to prepare for it, which was the kind of loss that does not arrange itself into stages the way the literature suggests, but arrives all at once and remains all at once for longer than you expect, and then settles slowly and incompletely into something that is still loss, but is also memory, and that the memory is the part you choose to carry. She carried James in the way of someone who has been in a long marriage with someone she genuinely respected, not with the specific ache of new grief which she had passed through, but with the particular quietness of someone whose understanding of the world was shaped fundamentally by another person's way of being in it, and who continues to see things through that shaping even after the person is gone. She had kept the alteration shop open for 2 years after he died, because the shop was hers, and the work was hers, and the work was one of the things that organized the days in the period when organized days were what she needed. She had closed it 3 years ago, not because it had become difficult, but because it had become complete. She had done what she set out to do with it. Built it from a table in her living room to a proper shop on Vine Street with 2 machines and a fitting room and a client list that included 4 families across 3 generations. And closing it at 72 felt like the correct end of a complete thing rather than an abandonment of an incomplete one. She had 3 grandchildren, Darnell's 2 daughters, Amara and Joy, and her daughter Celeste's son Marcus, who was the young man she had helped raise after Celeste moved to Pittsburgh for work when Marcus was 7, and Dorothy had said, "Leave him with me. Celeste, you'll be back in a year and a half," and she had been right about that. She still saw Marcus every Sunday for dinner, even now at 22, because Sunday dinner was the structure she had maintained through all of it through James's death, and the shop's closing, and the retirement, and the back, and Marcus brought the bread, and she made everything else, and they ate at the table where 4 generations of her family had eaten, and Marcus said, "Grandma, this is the best thing I've eaten all week every Sunday without exception, whether it was or not." She had come to observe a housing court case involving a woman named Evelyn Marsh, who lived 3 buildings down on Partridge Street, and who was being evicted by a landlord who had filed the eviction on grounds that Evelyn and her attorney, a young woman named Simone Bradley from the Hargrove Legal Aid Society, had characterized in their response as insufficient and retaliatory. Dorothy had known Evelyn for 12 years. She had altered Evelyn's daughter's prom dress and Evelyn's mother's church dress, and had been in Evelyn's apartment twice in the last year for coffee, and had decided when Evelyn told her about the hearing that she would come. She had asked Evelyn, "Can anyone come?" Evelyn had said, "It's public." Dorothy had said, "Then I'll be there." She had called Evelyn on the Wednesday evening before the Thursday hearing. She had said, "What time does it start?" Evelyn had said 9 o'clock. She had said, "I'll be there at 8:45. Evelyn had said, "You don't have to, Dorothy." She had said, "I know I don't have to." She said it the way she said things that were not in question, clearly, without elaboration, because the thing itself was clear. She had known Evelyn Marsh for 12 years. She had altered Evelyn's dress for her mother's 60th birthday, and Evelyn's daughter's prom dress the following spring, and Evelyn's own dress for the courthouse the year before, when a different matter had needed attending to, and she had sat in Evelyn's kitchen 3 times in the past year, listening to the progression of the landlord's notices and the legal aid process and the hearing date, and she had decided some time ago that she was going to be in the gallery for the hearing, because Evelyn had sat in Dorothy's kitchen when James died, and had been present in the way that mattered, which was quietly and without performance, and without making the occasion about anything other than what it was, and Dorothy had not forgotten it. She arrived at 8:45 for a 9 o'clock hearing. The courthouse opened its public doors at 8:30. She walked up the Aldridge Street steps. There were 22 steps from the sidewalk to the bronze doors, and she knew this because she had counted them in 1983, and had counted them again each time she had climbed them out of the habit of counting things that recurred, which was a habit James had had, and which she had acquired from him, and which she found useful, and she pushed through the bronze door into the lobby. Dorothy had been through that lobby so many times that she had the specific relationship with it that comes from repeated familiarity, the way you come to know a building not as architecture but as a sequence of physical experiences that have accumulated into something like acquaintance. She knew the particular way the terrazzo floor sounded under her good shoes, which was a specific dry resonance that was different from the sound of the floor under rubber soles, which most people wore, because most people did not know that the floor was terrazzo and had never thought about what good shoes sounded like on it. She knew the angle of the morning light through the tall windows and how it changed across the seasons. She knew which of the wooden benches along the wall was the one that had been moved in the 2019 renovation and had never been moved back to its original position, so that the proportions of the lobby were slightly off in a way that she noticed and that most people did not. She knew where the drinking fountain was and that it had been repaired in 2021 and worked correctly since then. She knew Paulette at the civil clerk's desk and the woman at the third-floor filing window whose name was Grace, and who had been there for 22 years, and who remembered Dorothy from the probate filing in 2009 and always said hello. She had known all of this for 41 years. It was not knowledge she had tried to acquire. It was knowledge that accumulates when you go to a place repeatedly and pay attention, which she did, which she always had. James had said, "Pay attention to where you are." He had not meant it as surveillance instruction. He had not been a person of surveillance. He had meant it as presence instruction, which was the instruction to inhabit the place you were in, rather than passing through it to let the place be real to you. Because places that are real to you are places where you feel your own right to be. The lobby of the Hargrove County Courthouse was a large rectangular room with terrazzo floors and high ceilings and the specific quality of civic light that comes through tall windows into a space that has been designed to receive the public, which means that it has been designed to accommodate people coming in for serious reasons and to treat that seriousness as something that the building respects. There was a security checkpoint immediately inside the door, a single screening station, one officer, a conveyor belt for items, a metal detector frame, and a second checkpoint at the interior door that led to the courtrooms and offices beyond. The officer at the first checkpoint was a man named Sergeant Roy Tillman, 41 10 years with courthouse security, known among the staff as reliable and by the public as something depending on the public. Tillman had taken the courthouse security assignment at 31 after 8 years on the municipal police force, where he had been a patrol officer in the 3rd District, and he had taken it because he had a daughter with a medical condition that required a schedule he could predict, and because the courthouse security supervisor at the time had offered him a shift that allowed him to be at school pickup at 3:15 every afternoon. He had been at school pickup every afternoon for 10 years. His daughter was now in her first year at the community college studying to be a dental hygienist, and she drove herself. And Tillman still worked the morning shift at the courthouse, because the morning shift was what he had started with and what he was good at, and because there was no longer a reason to change it. He was not at the first checkpoint when Dorothy Holloway came through the bronze door at 8:47. He had stepped away because he had been called by the interior checkpoint officer about a sealed court document that required a supervisor's signature, and he had said, "I'll be 5 minutes," and the 5 minutes had extended, because the sealed document matter required more than a supervisor's signature. It required a call to the clerk's office, and the call had been routed twice before reaching the right person. He had been gone 11 minutes when Calloway walked Dorothy to the door. He learned what had happened from Marcus Whitfield, the law student who stopped him at the interior checkpoint and showed him the footage and said, "This just happened. A woman was removed from the lobby. She's on the steps. Her name is Dorothy Holloway." Tillman watched the footage for 45 seconds. He did not watch it to the end. He said thank you, and he went to the bronze door. He was not at the checkpoint when Dorothy came through the bronze door. He was talking to a second officer, Officer Brett Calloway, 32, 14 months with courthouse security at the far end of the lobby near the building's information kiosk. Calloway had been assigned to the courthouse from the Municipal Security Services Division 18 months ago and had received in 14 months of courthouse assignment 3 internal complaints, one from a member of the public who had described his manner during screening as contemptuous, one from a courthouse clerk who had filed a report about his language to a visitor in the lobby, and one from a senior bailiff who had submitted a written observation that Calloway's approach to members of the public appeared to be determined by factors other than the stated security protocols. All three had been reviewed by the courthouse security supervisor. All three had been closed as unsubstantiated because each incident had been assessed individually. Dorothy came through the bronze door at 8:47. She walked toward the security checkpoint. She set her leather portfolio on the conveyor belt. She removed her coat and placed it on the conveyor belt. She placed her good shoes. She always wore shoes with modest heels to the courthouse, and she removed them as she had learned to remove them at every courthouse checkpoint she had ever used because it was the protocol in the provided basket. She stepped through the metal detector. The metal detector did not sound. Calloway was at the checkpoint by then. Tillman had gone back toward the second checkpoint, and he was looking at the screen for the conveyor belt X-ray. He said, "Step to the side." Dorothy stepped to the side. He said, "Open the portfolio." She opened it. Inside were 4 documents. Evelyn Marsh's court hearing. Notice a copy of the legal aid attorney's brief that Evelyn had given her in case it was useful, a small notepad and a pen. She held the portfolio open so the contents were visible. Calloway looked at the documents. He looked at her. He said, "What is the purpose of your visit?" She said, "I am here to observe a housing court proceeding." She said, "The hearing is at 9 o'clock, courtroom 4. The proceeding is public." He said, "Do you have documentation for this visit?" She said, "The proceeding is public." She said, "My identification is in my coat pocket." She said it evenly because she said things evenly. She had the specific evenness of a woman who has been asked questions like this in places like this before and has learned that evenness is not the same as deference, which was a distinction she understood and maintained. He said, "Step to the secondary screening area." She said, "I have passed through the metal detector." The metal detector did not sound. She said, "I am here to observe a public proceeding, and my identification is in my coat pocket, which I will retrieve." She reached toward her coat on the conveyor belt. He said, "Ma'am, do not touch the items on the belt." She stopped. She looked at him. She said, "My identification is in my coat pocket." He said, "I need you to step to the secondary screening area." There was no secondary screening area. There was a secondary checkpoint at the interior door. There was a bench against the lobby wall that was used for secondary review when the screening protocols required it. What Calloway said secondary screening area was not a designated area. It was a phrase that sounded official and was not. Dorothy Holloway, who had been in this courthouse 41 years and who had passed through this security checkpoint more times than she could count, knew there was no secondary screening area. She said, "I'd like to retrieve my identification." He said, "Step away from the screening station." She said, "I am 60 steps from being in contempt of a court of law if I am not seated by 9 o'clock. She said, "Courtroom 4, housing court, 9 o'clock. She said, "I am going to retrieve my identification, and I am going to go to courtroom 4 because the proceeding is public and I have every legal right to observe it." He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to leave the building." She said, "On what basis?" He said, "You are creating a disturbance." She looked around the lobby. There were 4 other people in the lobby, a young man with a briefcase who had come through the door behind her and was watching from the metal detector queue, a woman in her 40s with a folder who was at the information kiosk, and 2 courthouse employees crossing the lobby toward the interior checkpoint. None of them appeared to experience a disturbance. The lobby was quiet. The terrazzo floors reflected the morning light from the tall windows in the specific way they reflected it on clear winter mornings, which Dorothy had seen before and which was, as it always was, quiet and clear and civil. She understood what was happening. She had understood it from the moment Calloway had walked toward the checkpoint from the far end of the lobby because she had seen the walk before. Not in this specific form, but in the general form, which was the form of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and who is moving toward the doing without having done the assessment that should precede it. She had seen it at counters and checkpoints and in lobbies, and once at the entrance of a restaurant on Vine Street in 1987, where the host had told James that the reservation was unavailable, and James had said, and Dorothy had loved him specifically and precisely. For this, he had said, Then we'll come back when it is available. Which restaurant did you recommend in the meantime? The host had had no answer. They had eaten next door, which had been better, and James had said the thing about being treated incorrectly is that you get to decide what to do with it, and you should make the decision calmly and in the direction of your own dignity, because your dignity is the only thing in the situation you can control completely. She had been controlling her dignity since the moment Calloway walked across the lobby. She would continue to control it. She said, "I am standing at a security checkpoint with an open portfolio." She said, "That is not a disturbance." She said, "I am 75 years old, and I have been in this courthouse for 41 years, and I have never caused a disturbance in it, and I am not causing one now." Calloway said, "I need you to exit the building." He said it with the specific tone that she had heard before in her 75 years, which was the tone of someone who has decided that the authority they are attempting to exercise is correct, and who is not interested in the information that would tell them it is not. She had heard it at other checkpoints and in other lobbies and in other rooms where she was the oldest person present and the only black woman, and where someone had decided before she spoke that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be received. She recognized the tone. She stood still. The young man with the briefcase said, "Ma'am, is everything all right?" She said not entirely. She said it without looking away from Calloway. He said, "Sir, please continue through the checkpoint." He said it to the young man. He said to Dorothy last time, "Exit the building." She said, "I would like to speak to your supervisor." He put his hand on her arm. She did not move. She said, "Remove your hand." He said, "You're going to need to come with me." What happened in the next 40 seconds was recorded by the young man with the briefcase whose name was Marcus Whitfield. 27, a second-year law student who had been in the courthouse for a motion hearing and a course practicum and who had raised his phone when Calloway reached for Dorothy's arm because he understood immediately what he was seeing. The footage was clear and showed Dorothy standing at the security checkpoint with her coat and portfolio on the conveyor belt. Calloway's hand on her arm, and the specific still upright posture of a woman who has been grabbed in a public building by a security officer who has not stated a legal basis for doing so and who is not going to be moved by it. Calloway walked her toward the bronze door. She walked with him not because she was complying, but because the alternative to walking was being dragged, and she had decided that she was going to walk, and she had decided it in the specific way of someone who is filing every detail of what is happening in order to do something with it, and who understands that the doing requires the walking. At the top of the Aldridge Street steps, the 22 steps she had counted in 1983, and every time since he said, "This is as far as you go today." She said, "I see." She stood at the top of the 22 steps, and she held her wool coat. She had taken it from the conveyor belt, because she had said, "I am taking my coat," and Calloway had not prevented it. And she put it on because it was February, and the steps were cold, and she was going to stand on them until something changed. And standing on cold steps in February without a coat was not a stance that would serve the situation. She thought about James. She thought about his instruction, "You should see how it works, so you know." She knew how it worked. She had known for 41 years. She knew that what had just happened was not how it was supposed to work, and she knew that the not supposed to was something that could be addressed if it was documented, and documented correctly, and brought to the right person, which in this case was Judge Morrow, whose name she had seen on the courtroom. For docket that Simone Bradley had sent her, and whose reputation she had heard from Simone the previous week when Simone had said, "We have a good judge." Dorothy had said, "What makes a good judge?" Simone had said, "She reads the record, she asks the right questions, and she does not like waste." Dorothy had said what kind of waste Simone had said, the waste of not doing what is right, when you have the authority to do what is right. Dorothy had said, "I've liked this judge for 10 years. She did not go down the steps. She stood at the top of the steps, and she looked at the door. And then she took her phone from the pocket of her wool coat, which she had retrieved from the conveyor belt on the way out, and she called Simone Bradley, the legal aid attorney. Simone Bradley answered on the second ring. She said, Dorothy, the hearing's in 12 minutes. She said, are you in the building? Dorothy said, I'm at the top of the steps. She said a security officer named Calloway removed me from the lobby. She said I was at the checkpoint. The metal detector did not sound. I had opened my portfolio for inspection and asked to retrieve my identification. He said I was creating a disturbance and walked me to the door. There was a pause. Simone said, don't go anywhere. Dorothy said, I'm at the top of 22 steps in February. I'm not going anywhere. The young man with the briefcase, Marcus Whitfield, 27 second-year law student, had stayed in the lobby after Calloway walked Dorothy to the door. He had not gone through the interior checkpoint. He had waited because waiting was what the situation required and because he had been raised in a family where leaving when something wrong was happening was not what you did if you had the ability to stay. He had the footage on his phone. He had sent it to his professor at the law school with a message that said, Security officer removed a woman from the Hargrove Courthouse lobby this morning with no stated legal basis. She was observing a public proceeding. She passed through the metal detector without alarm. His professor replied in 4 minutes. The reply said, preserve that footage and email it to my university account. The professor's name was Raymond Osei, and he was a civil procedure specialist with 17 years of courthouse experience and an existing relationship with the Legal Aid Society, which he called after sending the reply to Marcus. Simone Bradley at 8:58 was already moving toward Judge Morrow's chambers when Raymond Osei's call came in. She was moving because Dorothy Holloway had called her from the steps, and she had said, don't go anywhere, and had then gone directly to Derek Osei's desk, the clerk no relation to the professor, and said, I need to speak to Judge Morrow. Derek had said the hearing starts in 2 minutes. Simone had said, I know, and Judge Morrow needs to know what just happened in the lobby. Derek had gone to chambers. He came back in 40 seconds. He said, she wants you in there now. Inside the courthouse, the housing court for courtroom 4, was the Honorable Claire Evangeline Morrow, 53. Appointed to the Hargrove County bench 11 years ago, formerly a legal aid attorney for 9 years and a private practice civil rights litigator for 7 years before that, and she was in her chambers at 8:55 putting on her robe when her clerk, a young man named Derek Osei, knocked and came in with the expression of someone who has just received information that requires immediate relay. He said, Your Honor, there is a situation in the lobby. She said, what kind of situation? He said, a security officer removed a woman from the building. She is on the steps. The woman is a member of the public who came to observe the Marsh housing proceeding. Her name is Dorothy Holloway. Simone Bradley from Legal Aid just called the clerk's desk. She said the woman passed through the metal detector, no alarm, and was asked to step to a secondary screening area that doesn't exist, and when she asked for her identification from her coat, the officer told her to step back and then walked her out. Judge Morrow stopped adjusting her robe. She said, Where is Sergeant Tillman? Derek said, I'm getting him. She said, Get him and then come back. She said, Is Mrs. Holloway still on the steps? He said, She is. She said, Make sure she stays there and is comfortable. She said, Bring her coat if she doesn't have it. She said it with the specific calm of someone who has been a legal aid attorney in courtrooms with people who were in the wrong, and who has learned that the specific calm is the correct tool for every situation that involves someone who needs to understand they are in the wrong without a performance of the understanding. Sergeant Tillman came to chambers 2 minutes later. He knew what had happened before Judge Morrow described it because Marcus Whitfield had shown the footage to the first courthouse employee he could find, who had been Tillman's colleague at the interior checkpoint, who had found Tillman immediately. Tillman said, I should have been at the checkpoint. Judge Morrow said yes. She said, and now we have a woman on the steps in February who has a legal right to be in this courtroom and who has been removed without basis. She said, I want her in this building in the next 5 minutes. She said, I want Calloway in my chambers immediately after the Marsh hearing. She said, and I want the full checkpoint footage from 8:45 to 9 this morning pulled and preserved. Tillman said, Yes, Your Honor. He left at a pace that was appropriate to the specific urgency of a courthouse security supervisor who has just been informed of a preventable incident by a judge who is known for the specific quality of attention she brings to preventable incidents. He went to the bronze door. He went down 3 steps. He said, "Mrs. Holloway." He said, "I am Sergeant Roy Tillman, Courthouse Security." He said, "I apologize for what happened." He said it the way people say an apology when they mean it, not performing it, not minimizing what they're apologizing for, saying it simply and completely. He said, "Please come inside." Dorothy looked at him. She had been standing on the step for 9 minutes. She was not cold, she had her coat, but she was standing on the step in February, and the step was cold, and she had not wanted to be on the step. She had wanted to be in courtroom 4 for the 9 o'clock proceeding, which had started 2 minutes ago. And the 9 minutes on the step were the 9 minutes of someone who has been excluded from a place they had the right to be, and who is standing in the place of the exclusion and not moving, because moving would concede something that was not there to concede. She said, "Sergeant Tillman, I would appreciate it if when I come inside, someone would explain to me on what basis Officer Calloway removed me from this building because I passed through the metal detector. The metal detector did not sound. I had opened my portfolio for inspection, and I asked to retrieve my identification from my coat. Those are not the actions of a person creating a disturbance." Tillman said, "Yes, ma'am." He said, "I will explain everything." He said, "Please come in from the cold." She came in. She came through the bronze door. The bronze door that had been original to the building, that had been polished by 80 years of hands to the specific warm shine of things that are used well and kept well. She collected her portfolio from the checkpoint. Calloway was not at the checkpoint. He had been told by Tillman to report to the security supervisor's office, and she straightened her coat and she walked across the terrazzo floor toward the interior checkpoint. She heard the specific sound of her good shoes on the terrazzo, the dry resonance she knew from 41 years of Thursday mornings in this building. She went through the interior checkpoint and past the wooden bench that had been moved in the 2019 renovation and had never been moved back. She went to courtroom 4. She had been on the steps for 9 minutes. She had missed 14 minutes of a hearing she had come specifically to witness. She sat in the gallery with the specific composure of someone who has been where she has been this morning, and who has returned to where she intended to be, and who is now going to be present for what remains. The landlord's attorney was presenting his grounds. She listened. She listened the way James had taught her to listen in places like this, which was completely without forming her response before the speaking was finished, because the speaking was the information, and the information was what you needed before you could know what to do with it. She had missed the first 14 minutes of the Marsh hearing. She took her seat in the gallery. Evelyn Marsh was at the respondent's table with Simone Bradley. The landlord's attorney was presenting his argument. Judge Morrow on the bench looked once at Dorothy when she sat down with the specific look of a person who has been informed of a situation and who is glad to see that the situation has resolved in the correct direction. It was not a prolonged look. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the judge on the bench, the woman in the gallery, a look that carried what it carried between 2 people who had not met and who understood each other in this moment precisely. Then Judge Morrow turned to the landlord's attorney and said, "Continue, please." The Marsh hearing had been delayed 4 minutes. Judge Morrow had requested the delay from her clerk, who had sent word to the courtroom, and the parties had waited the landlord's attorney with the particular impatience of someone who bills by the hour and who regards delays as costs, and Simone Bradley with the particular patience of someone who has been in legal aid long enough to understand that the process is not always linear and that the linearity is less important than the outcome. When Judge Morrow took the bench at 9:13, she did not explain the delay. She said, "We'll begin." She said it with the specific composure of someone who has just done 3 things simultaneously, spoken to a clerk about a lobby incident, read a security protocol, and prepared to hear a housing eviction case, and who is now in the room where the housing case happens, and who is giving it her complete attention. The hearing lasted 47 minutes. The landlord's attorney presented his grounds. Simone Bradley presented Evelyn's response, including the specific sequence of events that the Legal Aid Society had documented as retaliatory, and including the specific statutory provisions that made the retaliatory eviction unlawful under State Housing Code. Judge Morrow asked 4 questions. The 4 questions were the specific questions of a judge who has read the brief and understands the record, and is asking the questions that will produce the answers that are necessary to rule correctly. The ruling came at the end of the 47 minutes. Judge Morrow read it from the bench in the specific way she read rulings, not as a performance, but as a clear statement of what the record supported in language that was precise enough to be understood by the attorneys and specific enough to be understood by the parties, which was the distinction that made the ruling matter both as a legal document and as a human event, because Evelyn Marsh was sitting at the respondent's table, and the ruling was also for her in the way that rulings in housing court are also for the people whose housing is at issue, who are not just parties in a proceeding, but people in an apartment that is their home. It was in Evelyn's favor. After the Marsh hearing at 10:16, Judge Morrow went to her chambers and had Officer Brett Calloway brought in. Calloway came in with the expression of someone who knows what the meeting is about, and who is making a calculation about the best way to navigate it. The calculation was visible to Judge Morrow, who had seen it many times in many rooms, and who knew from the calculation being visible what she needed to do. She did not perform the conversation. She said, "Officer Calloway." She said, "I have reviewed the checkpoint footage from this morning." She said, "I have read the 3 prior complaints in your personnel file. I read them in sequence." She said, "I am going to tell you what I found." She said it the way she said things in her courtroom when the record was clear, not as a question because it was not a question, but as a statement of what she had found and what she intended to do about it. She said the footage shows Mrs. Dorothy Holloway passing through the metal detector without alarm. It shows her opening her portfolio for inspection. It shows her attempting to retrieve her identification from her coat, which she was entitled to do. It shows you telling her to step back, and then after she stated her intent to retrieve her identification and proceed to a public proceeding for which she had every legal right, walking her to the door. She said the footage does not show a disturbance. It shows a 75-year-old woman asking you clearly and calmly to state the basis for your actions. She said she asked twice. She said your 3 prior complaints document a pattern. The woman in the first complaint described your manner as contemptuous. The clerk in the second complaint described your language. The bailiff in the third described your approach as determined by factors other than the stated protocols. She said those 3 descriptions read in sequence describe what the footage shows. She said, "I am referring your file to the Courthouse Security Authority for review with a recommendation for disciplinary action and mandatory retraining." She said it clearly and without performance, and then she said, "Do you have anything to say?" Calloway sat in the chair across from Judge Morrow's desk. Her chambers were the chambers of a working judge, not spare because working judges accumulate papers and files, and the specific evidence of the cases they think about when they are not in the courtroom, but organized in the way of someone who knows where everything is and who regards disorder as a form of thinking incorrectly. There were 3 framed photographs on the wall behind her desk, one of the exterior of the Hargrove Legal Aid Society building, one of a courtroom she had argued in as a young attorney, and one of the courthouse steps which she had asked someone to take on her first day as a judge and which she kept because the steps were the thing that people walked up to, get to the place where the serious thing happened and they mattered, and she wanted to remember that they mattered. She had the checkpoint footage open on her computer. She had the 3 prior complaints open in a folder on her desk. She did not perform the preparation of being prepared. She was prepared. She looked at Calloway with the specific, complete attention she brought to her courtroom. The attention that is not intimidating because it is aggressive, but because it is accurate, the attention that sees what is there rather than what is supposed to be there. Calloway said, "Your Honor, I was following protocol." Judge Morrow said the protocol does not authorize you to remove a visitor from this building who has passed through security without alarm, asked to retrieve her identification, and stated her intention to observe a public proceeding. She said you removed her without basis. She said that is documented and it will be reviewed, and the review will find what I have found, which is that there was no basis. She said that is all. She had been a legal aid attorney before the bench. She had spent 9 years at the Legal Aid Society of the county and 7 years in private civil rights practice, and she had stood in courtrooms where the record was clear, and the parties needed someone on the bench to be willing to read it clearly and say clearly what it said, and she had learned in those 16 years what it cost in terms of the individual human life on the wrong side of the record when the person on the bench was not willing. She had been appointed to the bench at 42 after a judicial selection process in which the Bar Association had described her as exceptionally qualified, and the county executive's office had described her as not the most predictable candidate, which she had understood as a compliment. She had served 11 years. In 11 years, she had the specific record of someone who does not perform the role but inhabits it, who reads the brief and asks the right questions and makes the ruling that the record supports, which is not always the ruling that the room expects, and which is the only ruling that matters. She had the 3 prior complaints from Calloway's file in front of her by 9:50. Derek Osee had pulled them from the courthouse security files and placed them on her desk with the security checkpoint footage, and she had read them while the Marsh hearing continued in the next room in the specific way she read records, completely in sequence, without skipping, looking for what was consistent across the 3, rather than what each individual one said. Because the pattern was the record, and the individual incidents were the parts of the pattern, and reading only the parts was how you missed what the pattern was saying. The referral was filed the same morning. The review found what Judge Morrow had said it would find. Calloway was suspended 14 days and placed on a performance improvement plan. The courthouse security supervisor implemented a required second officer confirmation protocol for any removal of a visitor from the building. 2 officers, not 1, and a documented basis before the removal began. The protocol was circulated to all courthouse security staff by the end of the following week. The woman in the first complaint called the courthouse when she heard. She said, I filed that in 2023 and they told me it was unsubstantiated. The courthouse administrator's office took the call and forwarded it to the security supervisor and to the internal review team that was processing Calloway's case. The review team noted the call. The security supervisor called the woman back and said your complaint has been reopened as part of the current review. She said, I'm glad someone read it. He said, yes, ma'am. He said, I'm sorry no one did before now. The clerk in the second complaint heard about the ruling and sent a note to the security supervisor's office. It said, thank you for reading them together. The note was 3 lines. The security supervisor read it and sent a reply that said we should have read them together 2 years ago. I'm sorry we didn't. He meant it. He sent the note to his own supervisor with a copy of the clerk's note and a request that the complaint review process for courthouse security personnel be changed to require sequential review of all prior complaints before any individual complaint could be closed. The request was approved 4 weeks later and became policy. It was called in the policy document the sequential review standard, and it was 2 sentences. Complaints against courthouse security personnel shall be reviewed in conjunction with all prior complaints in the personnel file. No complaint shall be closed until the reviewing officer has documented their reading of the prior complaint file in its entirety. 2 sentences. Filed on a Tuesday. Dorothy Holloway did not know about the policy for 3 weeks until Simone Bradley called her to tell her. Dorothy said, good. Simone said, I thought you'd want to know. Dorothy said, I want to know about Evelyn's situation. Is she in the apartment? Simone said she's in the apartment. Dorothy said, good. She said, come to dinner. Simone said this Sunday. Dorothy said every Sunday. She said you can bring someone. Simone said just me. Dorothy said just you is fine. She said I'll make the pie. Marcus Whitfield, the second-year law student, sent the footage to the Legal Aid Society and to his professor that morning, and had received by 2 in the afternoon a call from a journalist at the county paper who had been covering the courthouse beat for 6 years, and who had received the footage from a source within the Legal Aid Society. The journalist called the courthouse public affairs office. The public affairs office called the security supervisor. The security supervisor called the courthouse administrator. By 4:30 that afternoon, the courthouse administrator had issued a short statement confirming that a security incident had occurred in the lobby that morning, that the matter was under internal review, and that the courthouse was committed to ensuring that all visitors were treated in accordance with applicable law and protocol. The statement did not name Dorothy Holloway or Officer Calloway. The footage, which had been published by the county paper by 5 o'clock, made both names available to anyone who wanted them. Evelyn Marsh called Dorothy at 5:15. She said, "Are you all right?" Dorothy said, "I'm all right." Evelyn said, "The judge ruled in my favor." Dorothy said, "I know. I was there for 47 of the 61 minutes." Evelyn said, "I know. I saw you come in." She said, "I'm sorry you were on the steps." Dorothy said, "I've been on worse steps." Evelyn said, "That's not." Dorothy said, "I know what it is." She said, "It is what it is. And it is also what I am going to do about it, which is what I've been doing since 2 this afternoon." Evelyn said, "What have you been doing since 2 this afternoon?" Dorothy said, "Writing 2 filings for the court and 1 complaint letter to the courthouse security authority, and making Sunday dinner for my grandson, because those things are not in conflict, and I had the time to do all 3. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She said, "That's exactly what James would have said." Dorothy said, "I know." She said, "Come to dinner Sunday." Evelyn said, "I'll bring dessert." Dorothy Holloway came back to the courthouse the following Thursday. She came through the bronze door. She counted the 22 steps. She went through the security checkpoint. Sergeant Tillman was at the checkpoint, and he said, "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," and she said, "Good morning, Sergeant Tillman," and she went to the 3rd floor to the civil clerk's office, where she filed a formal commendation for Sergeant Tillman and a formal request that the 3 prior complaints against Calloway be reviewed in conjunction with the incident of the previous Thursday in any future personnel action. The clerk, a woman named Paulette, accepted both filings and stamped them with the date. Dorothy said, "Thank you, Paulette." Paulette said, "Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Holloway. It's good to see you." She went to the lobby on the way out. She stopped at the security checkpoint. She said to the officer on duty, not Calloway, who was serving his suspension, she said, "I come here on Thursdays now." She said, "It is information." The officer said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Good." And she went through the bronze door and down the 22 steps and out onto Aldridge Street in the February light, which was the specific light of February in a city that is working toward spring and not quite there. And she walked to the corner and turned toward Vine Street, where her alterations shop had been for 19 years before the retirement, and where she now went sometimes on Thursdays, just to walk past. The way you walk past places that were yours once and remain yours in the particular way of memory which is permanent even when the thing itself has changed. The following Sunday she made dinner for Marcus and Evelyn's daughter, who had come from across town, specifically because her mother had called her on the Thursday evening and said Dorothy Holloway went to the courthouse for my hearing and stood on the steps in February, because a security officer put her there without cause, and she came inside and she sat in the gallery, and she went to the civil clerk's office after and filed a commendation and 2 complaints. Evelyn's daughter said she did all of that, Evelyn said, and made dinner. Evelyn's daughter said, "I'll be there Sunday." They ate at the table where 4 generations of Dorothy's family had eaten. Marcus brought bread. Dorothy made oxtail and rice and collard greens and a sweet potato pie that she said was routine, and that was not routine. She had been making that pie since she was 19 years old in her mother's kitchen, and it was by now one of the best things any of the people at the table had ever eaten, and they told her this every time, and she said it's just a pie, and she meant something different by that than they heard. After dinner, Marcus helped with the dishes and then sat at the kitchen table with his phone. He said, "Grandma, the footage has 112,000 views." She said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what that means?" She said, "It means 112,000 people saw a security officer remove a 75-year-old woman from a courthouse for asking to retrieve her identification." He said, "Yeah." She said, "What are they saying?" He read a few of the comments. She listened. She said, "Some of them are saying it correctly." He said, "Most of them." She said, "Good." She washed the pie dish and hung the dish towel on the hook by the sink, the hook that James had put up in 2001 and that she had not changed and did not intend to change. And she said, "The ones that matter are not the people watching the video." He said, "Who are the ones that matter?" She said, "The clerk who said thank you for coming in, the sergeant who came to the steps, the judge who read all 3 complaints in sequence." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And Simone Bradley." She said, "Simone Bradley is the reason Evelyn Marsh gets to stay in her apartment." He said, "You went to the hearing for that." She said, "I went for both." He was quiet again. He said, "Grandma." She said, "Yes." He said, "James would have gone too." She said, "I know." She said, "That is why I did." She had 3 things in the leather portfolio James had given her for their 40th anniversary: the formal commendation for Sergeant Tillman, the formal request about the prior complaints, and the court record of the Marsh housing proceeding which she had requested from the clerk's office as a public document, because Evelyn had asked her to keep a copy and she had said, "I'll keep 2. The leather portfolio had a clasp that James had repaired in 2007 when the original clasp had worn through, and Dorothy had said she was going to replace the portfolio, and James had said, "I'll fix the clasp." He had fixed it with a new clasp that was slightly smaller than the original, but functioned correctly and had continued to function correctly for the remaining 2 years of James's life, and for the 16 years since, because James had fixed things to last. Dorothy had continued to use the portfolio because it had been given to her for a specific reason, and because the clasp worked, and because the portfolio itself was good leather, and showed after 29 years the specific quality of good leather that has been well used, not worn out, but worn, in which was a different thing. She walked down the 22 steps. She counted them, because she always counted them, and she went out onto Aldridge Street. The February light was still the February light, low and particular, the kind of light that makes the ordinary things of a city more visible than they are at other seasons, which she had always liked about February, which was in many respects a difficult month, but which had this one consistent quality of light that she valued. She walked to the corner. She stood for a moment at the intersection of Aldridge and 9th, where the courthouse met the city, where the building with its 80 years of serious occasions met the street with its ordinary Thursday morning, and she thought about Evelyn, who was in her apartment on Partridge Street, and who would remain in her apartment because a judge had read the brief and asked the right questions. She thought about Marcus Whitfield, the law student, whose name Sergeant Tillman had given her, and who had stayed in the lobby when he could have left. She thought about Grace at the 3rd-floor filing window, who had been there 22 years, and who remembered her from the probate filing in 2009, and who had said when Dorothy filed the 2 documents that afternoon, "I'm glad you came in, Mrs. Holloway." She had been coming to this courthouse for 41 years. She had never once been removed from it before. She had been removed from it this morning for 9 minutes by a man without grounds, and she had come back through the bronze door and sat in the gallery and watched the judge read the record correctly, and she had filed 2 documents in the civil clerk's office, and she had counted the 22 steps on the way out, and she was going to count them again next Thursday. She was glad she had come in. She intended to come in every Thursday. The courthouse on Aldridge Street had been there for 81 years. It had been there through 11 elected judges and 4 renovations, and the specific accumulated weight of 81 years of serious occasions, and it would be there the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. And Dorothy Holloway would come up the 22 steps, and through the bronze door and across the terrazzo floor, and she would go to whatever room she needed to go to, and she would know where the drinking fountain was and which bench was in the wrong position, and Grace at the filing window and Paulette at the civil clerk's desk, and she would carry the leather portfolio with the clasp that James had fixed in 2007, and the portfolio would carry whatever needed carrying, and the courthouse would receive her as it had received the public for 81 years, as it was supposed to receive the public. As it had always been supposed to receive the public, which was without condition and without the specific particular failure of a young officer at a checkpoint who had not read his own protocols and who had encountered in Dorothy Holloway someone who had read them for 41 years and knew exactly where the failure was and what to do about it. She had been coming to this courthouse since she was 34 years old. She had never once been afraid of it. She had been on a Thursday in February removed from it for 9 minutes by a man without grounds. She had returned to it on her own feet through the bronze door across the terrazzo floor, to the room where the serious thing was happening, and she had sat in the gallery and listened and watched the judge ask the right questions and read the record correctly and rule in Evelyn's favor. She had then gone to the civil clerk's office and filed 2 documents, which was the correct response to a morning like this morning, and the correct response was what she had always made and what she would continue to make, because she had been raised in a house where the correct response was what you made, and because she had spent 41 years in a city and in a courthouse and in an alterations shop and in a marriage learning what the correct response was. And she knew it now with the specific certainty of someone who has been learning for a long time and who has arrived at a place past doubt. The courthouse would be there on Thursday. She would be there on Thursday. She would count the 22 steps. James had said, "Go see how it works, so you know." She had gone. She knew. She had known for 41 years, and she was not done knowing, and the courthouse on Aldridge Street was not done being the place where the serious things happened, and Dorothy May Holloway was not done being the kind of person who came through the bronze door when the serious things were happening. Because that was what she did, and what James had wanted her to do, and what she intended to keep doing for as long as the steps were there, and the door was there, and the terrazzo floor was there with the morning light on it, which it would be because it had been for 81 years, and she had been present for 41 of them. And she was not finished being present. She was 75 years old. She had time. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who count the steps and come back the following Thursday.